Have you ever been made to feel invisible in your own family? Imagine growing up, watching your sibling get everything they wanted, while you were left to pick up the pieces of a broken relationship. And then, when it's your turn to shine, they try to steal the spotlight. Well, that was my life, until the day I decided I had enough. From the very beginning, I knew I wasn't the favorite. My sister, the so-called golden child, was always the one who got all the attention, the praise, and the love. It wasn't even subtle. I grew up watching my parents dote on her, while I was left in the background, often blamed for things I didn't even do. It was as if I was invisible in my own home, a mere shadow to the shining light that was my sister. It wasn't just the small things, like her getting the bigger piece of cake, or always getting what she wanted during family trips. It was the way they'd believe her over me, no matter how much proof I had. If she accused me of something, I was punished, no questions asked. But when I accused her, the punishment was lighter, or even non-existent. The injustice was maddening, but I learned early on to stay quiet. But that was before my wedding day. You see, it wasn't just the small slights that hurt anymore. It was the fact that my sister had the audacity to try to walk down the aisle at my wedding. My day. The day I'd been dreaming of for years, and when I look back now, I realize that was the breaking point for me. I had spent my entire life suffocating under her shadow, but in that moment, I saw an opportunity to finally have the last word, to show my parents, my sister, and everyone else who had ever treated me as second best that I was no longer the quiet, passive sibling. This was my time, and the sweet revenge. It came on the very day I was supposed to walk down the aisle. Growing up, family dinners were always the same. The familiar scent of my mom's cooking filled the air as we sat around the table, each of us with our own place. My sister, always the center of attention, would sit across from me, her laugh ringing out like a bell, drawing our parents' smiles and approval. I would sit quietly, half listening to the conversation, half watching how effortlessly she commanded the room. My parents would talk about her latest achievements, her perfect report cards, her social life. They would ignore me unless they were pointing out something I'd done wrong. I remember one evening, after my sister had received yet another trophy for Best Student of the Year, the conversation shifted to me. My mom looked at me and asked, almost in passing, "How's school going, dear?" I could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, as if she wasn't really asking but just filling in the silence. My father, usually quiet, would give a nod and say, "Well, at least you're not causing trouble." And that would be it. That was all the attention I got. A simple, dismissive comment, quickly forgotten. But my sister, she thrived in their eyes. She was their pride, their perfect little angel. And the more they praised her, the more I shrank into the background. There was no space left for me to grow. I was always the one who had to stand back, to take the back seat, to make way for her. Every birthday was the same story. My cake was always her favorite flavor, even though I hated it. My gifts were always a little less thoughtful, a little less personal. And I wasn't supposed to mind. It was the way things were. As the years passed, the gap between my sister and me only grew wider. She was popular, well-liked, always surrounded by friends. I was the opposite, quiet, introverted, the kid who sat alone at lunch. And when she wasn't ignoring me, she was bullying me. It wasn't always physical. It didn't need to be. The words she threw at me stung more than anything else. She'd tease me about being awkward, about not fitting in, about not being as pretty or as charming as her. It was subtle at first. Little things, like the way she'd roll her eyes when I spoke or the way she'd mock my attempts at making friends. But over time, it escalated. By the time we were teenagers, the gap between us was wider than ever. She had no friends, but instead of admitting her own flaws, she blamed me. She began to pick on me relentlessly, accusing me of things I didn't do, ruining my friendships, isolating me from anyone who might offer me a sense of belonging. And somehow, my parents always believed her. If she said I was lying, they assumed I was. If she accused me of something, they punished me. I remember the day I realized she had no friends. We were in high school, and I noticed that she was always alone. Her once full lunch table was now empty. I wasn't happy about it. I didn't gloat. I didn't want to be like her. But I noticed, and I saw how it affected her. Her behavior started to change. She became bitter, resentful, and increasingly angry. I think that's when she started to see me as more than just a punching bag. She saw me as a threat. Our relationship changed. She no longer ignored me. She made sure to make my life miserable at every turn. She would accuse me of the smallest things, of stealing her clothes, of ruining her things, of being a bad sister. And my parents, as always, believed her. They never questioned her accusations. They never believed me when I tried to defend myself. There were times when I felt so alone, so isolated, that I wished I could disappear. But even in those darkest moments, I had one thing: my cousins. They were my escape. We didn't live in the same house, but we lived in the same town. We'd gather at family events, at birthdays, at holidays, and they'd treat me like I was important, like I mattered. I remember one family gathering, when I was probably around 12. My cousins invited me to join them at the park. I hesitated, unsure if my parents would allow it. When I told them no, my cousin asked me why. Without thinking, I blurted out, "I'm not allowed to have friends. My sister doesn't have any, so I'm not allowed to either." The words were out before I realized it, but they stung, and they were true. My parents heard, and they were furious with me for lying. But what did it matter? At least I had said it out loud. For the first time, someone else heard what I'd been going through. It didn't change anything immediately, but it made me realize that there was more to life than just living in my sister's shadow. As my sister's social status deteriorated, she moved schools. It was a humiliation that my parents couldn't ignore. They did whatever she wanted, even though it cost them more. I stayed the same. I kept my head down, kept my distance, kept hoping for something different. But deep down, I knew I was waiting for the day when I could finally stand up for myself. That day didn't come until my wedding. I thought that leaving home for college would be my escape, my chance to break free from the chains of my past. It was my fresh start, a new chapter, where I could finally be myself without the weight of my sister's shadow looming over me. My parents, as expected, made a big deal out of my departure. They threw a small going-away party, their faces full of mixed emotions, pride, sadness, and for my mom, a hint of guilt. For once I felt like I was getting attention for something good, for something I had earned. I moved into my new dorm, excited and terrified all at once. The sense of freedom that washed over me was liberating. I no longer had to worry about what my sister thought of me, what my parents thought of me. I was finally away from the constant comparisons, the endless scrutiny. I could just be. But no matter how far I went, the past still followed me. The scars my sister had left on me didn't fade overnight. The taunts, the accusations, the constant feeling of not being good enough, they stayed with me like a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. I threw myself into my studies, trying to focus, trying to build a life I could call my own. But even then, I found myself wondering if I was good enough, if I could ever be as perfect as she was. The thing was, I didn't want to be her. I never had. I just wanted to be me. And that seemed like the hardest thing in the world to do. The first few months were a blur of new faces, new classes, and new routines. I made a few friends, people who didn't know my history, who didn't know me as the invisible sister. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. My grades were good, I joined a few clubs, and I even started dating. His name was Matt, and he was everything I had hoped for: kind, smart, and totally different from anyone I'd ever met. I felt like I could finally start living the life I had always wanted. For once I wasn't the other sister. I was just me. But just when I thought I had found peace, my sister showed up in a way I could never have predicted. It was the beginning of the second semester when I got a message from home. At first, it was just a casual text from my mom, asking how I was doing. I responded, telling her about the new friends I had made, about my classes, about everything I was so excited about. And then she dropped it. "Your sister is coming to visit you this weekend. She needs some advice about college. She really wants to see you." I stared at the message for a long time. My heart sank. I didn't want to see her. I had spent so long trying to forget the way she had treated me, the way she had made my life miserable. But I couldn't just ignore my parents, could I? I knew what would happen if I did. They would guilt-trip me, make me feel like I was being selfish. So I agreed. When she arrived, it was like no time had passed. She was still the same, looking for attention, still trying to make herself the center of everything. But there was something different about her. Her confidence seemed forced, like she was wearing a mask. She had come to college to get advice from me. But it didn't take long for me to realize that it wasn't advice she wanted. It was something else. She had been quiet for a while, sitting in my dorm room, looking around, almost like she was waiting for something. And then she said it. "You know, it's not fair, you know. You get to live here, do your own thing, and everyone just loves you. Mom and Dad just want you to be happy. They always say how proud they are of you, but they don't see how hard it is for me, how I'm always stuck trying to live up to their expectations." I stared at her, completely caught off guard. For a moment I couldn't respond. I had never heard her speak like this. She was always so sure of herself, so determined to be the best. But now, here she was, pouring out her insecurities to me, the very thing I had spent my whole life trying to escape. For the first time, I saw her for who she really was, someone who was just as lost as I had been. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I saw my sister in a way I never had before. She wasn't just the golden child. She was just a person, struggling with her own demons, her own fears. The pressure to be perfect had worn her down. The attention and praise that she had received all these years had turned into a burden, not a blessing. And it made me realize that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the enemy I had thought her to be. But that wasn't enough to make me forget the years of hurt, the years of pain that she had caused me. I couldn't just forgive her. Not yet. I had spent too much time rebuilding myself, finding my own way in the world. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could just move past everything, I knew that I had to stand up for myself. The real change came when she asked me something that took me completely by surprise. "Would you help me get into the same college as you? I need to get out of the house. I don't think I can take it anymore." And that, right there, was the moment I realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the one holding all the power. I was. And I could either help her, be the bigger person, or I could do something that would change everything. As I sat there, listening to my sister's words, a wave of emotions crashed over me. Part of me wanted to help her. Part of me felt sympathy for the first time in years. But another part of me, the part that had spent so long buried under her cruel treatment, wanted to shut her out, to refuse to be her emotional support any longer. I had worked so hard to build a life for myself, to escape the suffocating shadows of our family dynamic. And now, my sister was asking me for help. Help that I didn't feel ready to give. I was still angry, still hurt by everything she had put me through. She looked at me, eyes wide, vulnerable for the first time in what felt like forever. "Please, I don't know what else to do. I need to get out of here." Her voice was quiet, desperate, But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't asking because she cared about me or our relationship. No, she was asking because her life, which had always been so carefully constructed around her image of being perfect, was falling apart. She had nothing left. She had no one to fall back on except me, the sister she had tormented for years. And in that moment, I knew that whatever I decided to do next would shape the rest of our relationship forever. I told her I'd think about it, but deep down, I knew I wasn't sure what to do. I had worked so hard to build my independence, to separate myself from the family that had never truly seen me, never truly valued me. Helping her meant letting her back into my life, opening a door I had closed so firmly. And as much as I tried to convince myself that I could just help her and move on, I knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The decision weighed heavily on me for days. My parents, of course, didn't know the full story. They never saw how their favoritism towards her had torn me apart. They were too wrapped up in their idealized image of my sister to ever question whether or not she had done something wrong. In their eyes, she was still the perfect daughter, the golden child who could do no wrong. But I saw her for who she was now, the broken girl who had once held all the power, but was now desperately trying to cling to the remnants of her image. I had always been the one who took the back seat, the one who was ignored and overlooked. But now, I had a choice. I could let her back into my life and risk everything I had fought for, or I could finally put myself first and say no. One night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of the decision was suffocating. I got up and sat by the window, staring out at the city below. The lights shimmered like distant stars, and I couldn't help but think about the choices I had made so far in my life. I had always done what others expected of me, tried to meet their standards, always hoping for some kind of validation that never came. But now, I realized something important. I had the power to make my own choices. I didn't need their approval anymore. I knew that helping my sister would mean reopening wounds I had spent years healing. But I also realized that if I didn't, I would be holding on to the same bitterness, the same resentment that had been eating me up for years. I had to make a decision for myself, and I knew it had to be something that wasn't about pleasing anyone else, not even her. The next day, I met my sister again. This time, I was calm, collected. "I've thought about what you said," I started, my voice steady, "and I'm going to help you." Her face lit up with relief, but I held up my hand before she could speak. "But on my terms." Her expression faltered, confusion crossing her face. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, taking a deep breath, "I'm helping you get into college. I'll help you find a way out, but I'm not doing it because I feel sorry for you. I'm doing it because you need to understand something. You're not the only one who's been hurt, and I'm not going to let you treat me like your personal punching bag anymore. If we're going to move forward, things have to change between us. You need to earn my trust again, and you need to stop making everything about you." I saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, the realization that this was no longer the dynamic she was used to. But she didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and relief. I could see she wasn't used to this side of me, the side that wasn't afraid to stand up for myself. The rest of the conversation was awkward as we navigated the uncharted waters of this new relationship. But something had shifted. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first left home, and I knew she wasn't either. We both had our baggage to carry, but I was no longer willing to let hers weigh me down. Over the next few weeks, I helped her with the college application process, offering advice, guiding her through the steps. It wasn't easy. She had a lot to work through, a lot of bad habits to break. But I saw glimpses of the person I always wished she could have been, vulnerable, honest, and willing to change. And then the day came. The day I had been dreading, my wedding. I had been planning it for months, carefully choosing every detail to make it perfect for me. I had decided that I wanted a small, intimate ceremony with close friends and family. But when my sister showed up, dressed in a wedding gown of all things, my heart sank. She looked at me with those same wide eyes, her face filled with a mix of defiance and desperation. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She was trying to steal my moment, but this time I wasn't going to let her. I walked down the aisle, not with the weight of years of favoritism and hurt on my shoulders, but with the strength of someone who had finally learned to stand up for herself. And when I saw my sister standing there, trying to get attention, I knew this was my moment. I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. Not anymore. The day of my wedding should have been one of the happiest days of my life, but as I stood at the altar, I couldn't ignore the swirl of emotions inside me. My sister's appearance in a wedding dress, attempting to steal the spotlight, was the final test. It was a culmination of everything that had led up to this moment, years of favoritism, neglect, and pain. But this wasn't the moment for me to collapse under the weight of my past. No, this was my moment to stand tall and to finally be the person I had always dreamed of becoming. As I walked down the aisle, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but with each step, I felt a little lighter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be anyone else's idea of who I should be. I wasn't the invisible sister anymore. I wasn't the one who had to make way for someone else. This was my day, my choice, my time to shine. And in that moment, I realized something that I had been denying for years. Family, while it shapes you, doesn't define you. Looking at my sister in that moment, I felt a mixture of sadness and understanding. She wasn't just trying to steal my moment. She was desperate for validation, desperate to be seen, to feel important. I had spent so long resenting her, but in that moment, I understood something about her pain. She had grown up under the same weight of expectations that I had, but instead of running from it, she had embraced it, using it as a tool to get attention. I knew then that her actions weren't about me. They were about her trying to find her place in a world that had never truly seen her. But that realization didn't change the fact that I had spent my entire life living in her shadow. It didn't erase the years of hurt or the years I had spent questioning my worth. What it did was give me the strength to let go of the past, to stop holding on to the bitterness that had held me captive for so long. As I stood before my husband, ready to take that final step into a new chapter of my life, I understood the most important lesson of all. Family doesn't have to be the ones who define you. You define yourself. The love, the approval, the validation that I had been seeking from my parents and sister for so long. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had learned to love myself. I had learned to stand up for myself. And that, more than anything else, was what had brought me to this moment. It wasn't just my sister who had to learn to see me. I had to learn to see myself, too. For years, I had been trying to be someone I wasn't, trying to please people who would never see me as I truly was. But the moment I let go of their expectations, I found freedom, I found peace, and I realized that I had the power to make my own choices, to shape my own future, regardless of the past. As the ceremony continued, I couldn't help but notice the looks on the faces of my family members. My parents, who had once been so quick to dismiss me, were now sitting in silence, their faces a mixture of shock and shame. My sister, who had tried so hard to undermine me, was sitting at the back of the room, her eyes filled with a strange combination of jealousy and regret. I didn't feel victorious in that moment. I didn't feel like I had won. What I felt was something deeper, something I had never felt before. I felt free, and it was in that moment, as I exchanged vows with my husband, that I realized the power of forgiveness. Not forgiveness for my sister, not forgiveness for my parents, but forgiveness for myself. I had spent so much time holding on to the pain of the past, allowing it to define who I was. But I didn't need to carry that anymore. I could let go. I could move forward. This day, my wedding day, wasn't just about the love I had found with my husband. It was about the love I had found within myself. The acceptance, the freedom to be who I truly was. And as I looked at my husband, standing beside me, I realized that the family I had always wanted wasn't the one I had been born into. It was the family I was building, one of love, respect, and most importantly, understanding. The lesson I had learned wasn't just about standing up for myself or overcoming my past. It was about realizing that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one with yourself. Once you have that, everything else falls into place. And that was the real victory. As the last notes of the wedding march faded into the background, and I stood next to my husband, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, a deep relief that had been missing for so long. The room, once filled with tension and expectations, now felt different. It wasn't the family I had hoped for, but it was the family I had created in this moment, surrounded by people who genuinely saw me for who I was. I glanced around, noticing the quiet, almost shocked expressions on my parents' faces. My mother, who had spent so many years demanding perfection, and my father, who had always been distant, were finally realizing what they had overlooked all these years. I didn't need their approval to feel complete anymore. In that moment, I was whole. The years of trying to meet their expectations, the years of being the second fiddle to my sister, they were finally behind me. But it wasn't just my parents who were learning something. My sister, standing at the back of the room, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and regret, was also facing the consequences of her actions. The golden child, the one who had always been the center of attention, was now on the outside, looking in. For once, the power had shifted, and it felt freeing. I knew, deep down, that the story didn't end here. It never really does. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs when we least expect it. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I could handle whatever came my way. I had learned the hard way that you can't wait for others to change. You can only change yourself. As my husband and I exchanged vows, I realized that this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about everything that had brought me to this point. The struggles, the heartache, the lessons learned. And for the first time, I understood what true freedom felt like. It wasn't about escaping my past. It was about facing it, embracing it, and finding peace with who I had become. The ceremony ended, and as we walked out of the hall, hand in hand, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything finally lifting off my shoulders. The journey wasn't easy and the scars were still there, but they no longer defined me. I was ready to step into the future, no longer defined by my past, but empowered by the lessons it had taught me. As we stepped into the sunlight, I turned to my husband and whispered, "This is just the beginning." And I couldn't help but wonder, what happens when we finally stop letting others define us? When we stop waiting for someone else to give us permission to be who we truly are? The truth is, it's never too late to take control of your own story.